Hey guys, welcome back. I'm not sure if you've watched the reliability video first or if you're getting to this one first, but I'm going to give a quick little recap of where we've been just in case to kind of orient us. So first of all, this is part of the series of understanding statistical information. And remember, the purpose is not necessarily to be good at the math or to understand the nuances of test development or how research process works. It's to be able to consume this stuff and make good clinical decisions. Now remember, we talk about this in two different ways. One, we're talking about test development and the way tests function, and we're also talking about how the statistics are used in research purposes, and they're kind of different things, but the math it overlaps, and so we're kind of going to separate those things out as we go forward here, but we're going to talk about both of those. But the main priority here, and what I would like for us to do, is I would like us to prepare ourselves for making good, sound clinical decisions by being consumers of this information here. So let's do a quick little recap here of what reliability and validity are for those of you that, if this is the first time you're coming to this for years or you still get kind of confused sometimes about what the difference is, let's do a little recap of them. So first of all, generally speaking, validity means that a test, and we'll talk about testing now, a test measures what it's intended to measure. If I have, again, I'll use this example all the time. If I have the Beck's depression inventory, I want to be able to measure depression. If it doesn't measure depression and it measures something completely different, it's not a valid test, right? And remember, it's a matter of degrees here. So I just want to know that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. That's the important thing. And remember also that the valid results mean that number, whatever number I get on whatever test, that means it measures something that's real in the world. We're not just doing this to sort of draw out these abstract concepts. We want to know what's actually happening with real human beings over time, from year to year or over space, from West Coast to East Coast of the US, whatever. We want to know that it measures real things. That's the important part here. So just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, but remember, validity is it measuring what it's intending to measure? And reliability is, does it do that over multiple times or multiple versions of a test or between two different people? We want consistency and dependability in the process, and validity refers to accuracy, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. I like this quote from the book because it helps us understand. They just say it in a really good job, I think, a really good way. As a counselor using assessment, you must be able to evaluate the argument for validity made by test developers. In other words, is the test a good one? They do a lot of work to make sure the tests are useful and with different groups of people over different administrations and different times and all that kind of stuff. And you need to be able to say, yeah, I think so. I think your work is sound. As far as research goes, we need to be able to evaluate the argument for validity made by a researcher also to determine if the research is sound. If I'm reading through an article and they give me a bunch of information about the tools that they were using to measure how effective their new treatment modality is or something like that, I need to be able to say, yeah, but you used a bad test. Your process was good, but the test was wrong. Or you used the Beck's depression inventory and that's reliable, but the way you used it did not produce the results that I think you're seeing. That's the kind of thing that we can do, okay? So there's that. And I thought that was said really well there too. So there's a couple other things though that we need to understand about validity as we move forward with this. Sometimes in a colloquial way, we talk about validity as if things are either valid or not valid. Or we use it in a way that says like, we use the word valid as if we mean true. Like if somebody's telling us something like, I just went to the grocery store, and you're like, that is not valid because I saw you at the bookstore or whatever. Sometimes we use it as true. But again, we're not necessarily saying a test is true. We're saying the results accurately reflect the real thing in the world, okay? And that's an important nuance here that we need to understand. The other thing that we need to understand too is that validity is not just a black and white thing. It's a matter of degree. It's never either valid or not valid, black and white, right or wrong, true or false, whatever. It's a matter of degree. So when we're talking about, does the test measure what it's supposed to? We're talking about it it measures it mostly or partially or something like that. So even though when we're diagnosing, we'll just use this as an example again, we're diagnosing depression or anxiety, and there is a clinical cutoff where we say this person either has or does not have anxiety or depression, the test is not going to necessarily tell you that. The test is going to say they have a mild, moderate, or severe or something, anxiety or depression, and the validity of is it doing what it's supposed to be doing is going to change depending on when you give it and how you give it and all that kind of stuff. But just because a validity level is not perfect does not mean that it's not useful. Okay, so that's an important nuance here, that we can make some choices that might reduce the validity, but we still use the tool anyway because it does something very important. And looking at number 3 here, here's another example of that. Validity is not a unitary concept, and there are different kinds of validity, which we'll get into. So one of the things that's important to know is, like, if I norm a test, remember that was a term we talked about last year. Norming means that I find out what is considered normal behavior, and I norm the test on white college males, which is something that typically happens a lot. If that test is normed on white college males and it measures level of depression, I might find out what a normal level of depression is for that group, right? And so I use the test and I say, yep, it's valid. I just did all the work to figure that out. And then I go give the test to, let's say, middle-aged Native American women, and I get lower results for my test of depression. And I say, like, oh, they have lower results than normal, but that doesn't mean that the test is invalid, because I might just have the wrong norms. It might still be a valid test, or it may not. But it just depends on how we're using it and in what circumstances. Okay, so this is where things get really complicated, because, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds here because I don't want to overcomplicate this, but when we have a test that's not normed on a certain population and we're like, oh, but the tests are low, or the results are lower or higher, therefore they don't actually fit. However, if we go back and validate that test and we find out that those results, the lower number is actually normal for their population, and so it's normed to be different. And so, I don't know, there's just a whole bunch more that we could go into there. But the point to understand here is that validity can be different depending on who it's given to and when, and it's always a matter of degree, not necessarily a black and white kind of thing. I got ahead of myself a little bit here, but a test is not valid for all purposes or all groups. Remember the hammer analogy? A hammer can be useful depending on the circumstances, the type of nail, the type of wood, the type of activity, whether it's indoors or outdoors or whatever, you know, all that stuff. So doesn't necessarily mean the hammer is wrong. That's the whole idea. Now, if you go out to the internet and you look up the different kinds of validity, we're going to go into a little bit of detail in some of these here so you can have more information to equip yourself with telling whether something is valid or not valid, or the degree to which it is. Probably what you'll find is this pneumatic device called the 3 C's, or the construct, criterion, and content validity. It's a really nice, helpful way to remember the different types of validity. However, it's a little confusing because underneath construct and criterion content, there are sometimes these variations of different kinds. There's like this big umbrella of validity, then there's these 3 types, and then each one has its own nuances. It gets a little messy. But the other thing that kind of misses is there's this other really important consideration when we're talking about clinical utility of testing, and that's something that gets missed in any of those conversations. So I'm going to talk about that after I explain some of these things. And the way the book talks about it, it's this contemporary and updated version of discussions of validity. So just know that if you're going out there looking for study guides on validity and you see those 3 C's, those are still okay to use, but there's this important other part that I think is worth considering that I'll get to in just a minute here. So let's talk about these. Remember the other day when we were talking about we're talking about criterion reference norms versus criterion reference stuff, we'll say, versus norm reference tests. A criterion reference test is you're measuring a person against a certain list of knowledge information or a certain performance ability. Remember, like the example of like the driver's test. you're not testing against other drivers. You're testing of, do they have enough knowledge and can they perform behind a wheel well enough to be safe on the road? That's a certain set of criteria. Whereas the norm reference is measuring against other people's and what we consider to be normal. Now, the construct, what we're talking about when talking about driving, is that we develop this list of, you have to know enough about these things in order to be safe. And you have to be able to perform at a certain level enough to be safe, right? Another example of that is if you were to open up the DSM and you said, here are the list of diagnostic criteria for something like depression. It's no bigger and no smaller than it has to be. So when we're talking about the construct of depression, we can say it's this list of stuff, okay? It's either ideas or a hypothesis or something that describes behavior. That's what we're going to talk about here. So what is a threat to validity? A threat to validity essentially is saying that if validity is measuring what it's intending to measure, a threat would be something that gets measured that's not supposed to, or something that gets missed. So one of those things is called construct underrepresentation. In that sense, let's say, just for sake of example, I'm going to use round numbers to make it simple. Let's say the criteria for depression includes 10 different symptoms. It doesn't, but let's just say it does for now, just make it simple. Construct underrepresentation would be if depression has 10 different symptoms and I give a test for depression that only has 5, I'm really not capturing the whole of what depression is or what all the symptoms are. So the construct is underrepresented in the test that I'm using. That's what we're talking about here. It gets a lot more complicated than that when we're talking about things like intelligence and personality, but construct underrepresentation means I'm not capturing the whole of what I'm trying to understand here. Let me give you an example here just real quick. Let's say I want to test for understanding dogginess. Like I see this animal, it's running around me and it's, rubbing up against my leg and I'm like, what kind of animal is that? Strange. And I have this test and it says, does the animal have fur? Yes. Okay, good. Check. Does the animal have a wet tongue? Yes, it does. Check. Okay, perfect. Therefore, it must be a dog. All right. And I look around, things starts barking, and I'm like, oh, wonderful. I love dogs. And then all of a sudden, another animal comes around, starts meowing, and I say, oh, okay, good. Does it have fur? Yes. Does it have a wet tongue? Yeah, and it's a little scratchy too, but it's still wet. So therefore, that animal must be a dog. Well, that's not a dog. It's a cat because it meowed, right? But the test can't reflect that real difference out in the world. And so that would be an example of construct underrepresentation. The opposite of that, or the contrary to that, is, and it says it in this kind of jargony statistical language, construct irrelevant variance. In other words, instead of the test being too narrow, it's too broad. In other words, it doesn't capture the uniqueness of a dog. If I had a test that said, does it have fur? Does it have a wet tongue? Does it bark? Does it have fins or wings? Well, all of a sudden, I'm not testing just dogginess, but I'm adding questions that have something to do with fish and birds, and that means it's too wide. The test is too broad, so it's testing too many things as opposed to too little. So they're essentially kind of just the opposite there. Okay, switch gears just a little bit. The test content. Now this one gets a little bit confusing, so let me use a different example. And when we're talking about test content, it's a little bit similar to what we're talking about before, but the relationship between the test content and the construct being measured is different. In other words, 10 symptoms. I'm not talking about just more or less of those 10 symptoms. I'm talking about the test questions just being kind of like off base and irrelevant. It's a little bit similar to what we just talked about, but an example would be if I was testing your knowledge of this class, and this class is assessment in counseling, right? But if I were adding questions about medical concepts related to disability, which is another class that we teach in the program, if I were adding questions related to that, all of a sudden I'm not measuring what I'm supposed to be measuring. If I want to measure your knowledge of English literature and I add in questions about Spider-Man, I guess that technically could be English literature if you include comic books, but hopefully you get the idea. Well, let's say if I ask questions about some Russian novel or something like that, it's just not what it's supposed to measure. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about test content. One of the confusing things, quick side note here, one of the confusing things about these discussions of validity is that some of these definitions can seem very similar, and sometimes they can say like, well, it's under the umbrella of they're all validity concerns, and this one it's related to content, kind of like criteria, but it's a similar thing. This is where it can get kind of confusing. So if you're like, how are they different? Suffice to say that if you don't see the difference, that's kind of okay. What we want to know is there a problem, and how big of a problem is it? But if you're having trouble distinguishing the difference between content, criteria, and all that kind of stuff, we're just going to gloss over those for now, and you can go get a doctoral degree and read books about content validity or something if you want to. I don't know. But there's more to it, but if you're finding yourself confused, try and sit with that a little bit and not be too overwhelmed by it. Okay, back to the task at hand here. Talk about number 2. The response process. That can also be a point of error in the process or something that would invalidate. Here's an example. If I want to know how good somebody is at giving speeches or their speech ability, their ability to eloquently talk or even get words out or something, if I want to know that, and I hand them a piece of paper and a pencil and I say, okay, I'm going to give you this test and you sit quietly here for 10 minutes, fill out the answers, and then they'll determine how good you are at speaking. Well, the process of collecting information via paper pencil has nothing to do with their talking out loud. And so sometimes just giving a test a certain way can invalidate the results completely. This is really common when it comes to people who need accommodations. It's like saying, I'm going to give you an intelligence test, and you are a non-speaking person who lives with autism, and I'll give you this intelligence test, and because you don't respond in the way to my verbal questions, I assume you're intelligent. Well, I'm supposed to be measuring intelligence, but I can't because you're not speaking in the way that I'm asking you to. If I make the assumption then that you're unintelligent, the test is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, not because you're not intelligent, but because it's doing it in a process that doesn't work. That's the idea here. So the process is really important. Another one that I think is really important and relevant to our training as counselors is when you come in and you fill out some of you took the GRE, not everybody does, but some of you took the GRE, and the GRE is intended to predict how successful you're likely to be in an academic setting in college, and you submit your GPA and all that kind of stuff. That tells us information about how likely you are to be successful with the workload and with writing in an academic way and sort of all the school-like experiences. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be mature enough and ready enough in terms of your own biophysical responses to stress. It doesn't mean that you're going to be to have the capacity to come up with good questions and to respond in empathetic ways. Those competencies are a little bit different. Now, we have a process that includes letters of reference, character references, and writing an essay so we can get a sense of your personhood and your whether you have potential to assume those counseling skills later on. But if we didn't have those letters of reference or ask you to write an essay, our process would essentially be not that valid because we'd be testing your academic potential and not your counseling potential. So those are examples of like how a process can be to change the validity of a test, essentially. There's a lot more that we could talk about there. I could talk about that for too long because I get to do that for my work, but we'll save that for another day. In class, some of you have talked about this already too. Other sources of threats to validity, internal structure. Now, I've maybe mentioned this before too, but if I give a question at the beginning of a test, like, do you like apples, for example, and then later on in the test, I ask another question like, do you like fruits that fall from an apple tree? Not the same exact question, but it's basically getting at the same thing. There are all kinds of internal ways to structure questions that if I do that wrong, I might not get the same answer. Because you might look at that and be like, yeah, I like apples. And then you read the next question about the fruit falling from an apple tree, and I'm like, I don't like fruit that falls to the ground. I don't like that, whatever. And so if I structure that wrong and I word the sentence wrong, or I put it too far apart or something, you can mix up the results and get different results. In other words, you'd likely have, here I am fumbling again. It would be ideal for a person to say, if they actually like apples in the real world, they say yes to the first question and yes to the second one. But if I structure that wrong, I might get them saying yes to one and no to the other. That's the idea. I'll skip over the example because that's just going to confuse us more probably if I respond to it at this point. Relationships to other variables too. How well does the test result actually predict what it's supposed to? I mean, that's kind of the definition of validity right there. Here's the point that I was going to make about that one. I was like, that seems so obvious. Why would I even say that? But remember when we were talking about the correlations between the Beck's depression inventory and the Beck's anxiety inventory? And we said they have a 0.66 reliability coefficient, correlation coefficient. That means that if my test measures not enough of the depressive unique symptoms, and I measure things like concentration or fatigue, then I might come out of that test assuming this person has anxiety and not depression. So it might be measuring too much of other variables too. So hopefully that feels like it came out in a really confusing way. So if you're confused, I'm sorry. But the point is, it's not doing what it's supposed to be, right? Okay, now this last point here, number 3, by the way, I think we're almost done here. Yeah, we have 2 slides left. The last point, number 3, this is the part where when I was saying like there's that mnemonic device, sorry, not pneumatic. That's a totally different thing. Mnemonic device. The 3 C's, construct, criterion, and content. And I said there was another thing that is worth considering that we don't typically consider. That's this number 3 here, and that's the consequence of testing. So the way that I can let me read this first. Tests are expected to provide benefit, but if they don't, then you're not doing what they're supposed to do. And here's what that means. If I give, the whole purpose of counseling is to help a person do something in their life, whether it's change or provide new tools for coping with the situation or curing their symptoms or whatever. The therapeutic process is supposed to be therapeutic, to be a little redundant. It's supposed to help people. If I take a test and if I give a person a test and it collects a bunch of information for me and it doesn't really help them make progress therapeutically, then there's question of whether the test is doing what it's supposed to be doing. If we assume that all tests are gathering information for a benevolent cause, for helping a person, then it does what it's supposed to. But if it's doing more harm than good, or it's hurting a certain group of people, or it's creating more difficulty or something like that, then what people say is counseling is about therapy, it's about getting better. And if this is doing worse or it's causing more harm than good, then it's not valid. And it's what people are now saying in the counseling world is that this is not a valid test because it's doing more harm than good. That's essentially the argument there. So there's a lot to unpack there in terms of, well, what about if it's doing more harm to one population versus another? Or even though it may do some harm to some people, it's worth it for the overall public welfare. There's a whole bunch to talk about in terms of that, especially when we're talking about diversity and multiculturalism, that kind of stuff. But this is where we can say, it's not just that it's like a social problem, it's also a scientific problem. And that's why we include it in this discussion here. Because if a test is not properly normed on a certain group of people and then it's used on that group of people, what that means is it's not necessarily a bad test and it's garbage and it's invalid. It means that we need to do some work to expand our understanding of how the test works so that we can use it in a way that benefits people instead of harms them. That's the idea here. So there's a lot more to say about that, and we'll just save that for a class discussion some other time. Okay, this is our last slide. When we talk about validity, I've given you a whole bunch of abstract words to explain these concepts. But we can also talk about it in terms of numbers, because when I say there's matters of degree of validity, it's hard to say it's a lot or a little, or what constitutes a big enough concern that we should not use a test or something like that. So people have made strides and efforts to try and put numbers to this so we can say, how do we know when the validity concern is enough to stop using it or to not consider it acceptable or something like that? And here's how that has turned out. Very much like when we talk about correlations, somewhere between -1 and +1, a correlation will fall in there. If it's 0, that means there's no relationship between those two variables. There's no correlation. If it's 1, we know there's a very strong correlation. Same thing with -1. And the positive or negative symbol tells us a little bit about the direction of that relationship. If you remember that stuff from last week. Similarly, validity coefficients are they're very similar. They're measured in a very similar way. So you'll likely see something that is between 0 and 1, or 0 and something like that. And the hard thing about this, though, I mentioned this in the other video about reliability, is that when we're talking about reliability, an acceptable level of reliability is typically somewhere around 0.7 and higher. However, with validity, an acceptable level of validity is as you can see here, between 0.21, and 0.39, or anything higher. And that can be really confusing, because you'll see a number like 0.5 and you're like, is this the reliability coefficient or validity coefficient? Or we're talking correlations here, whatever. And unless you use this stuff all the time, or you're selecting tests all the time, or you get real into the science of the research and all that stuff, it can be really confusing. So what I'm telling you here is that you don't have to memorize this. What you want to do is you want to have this as a reference, because if you're choosing a test and it talks about the reliability coefficients and validity coefficients, and they give you two different numbers, you want to make sure you're understanding what that number means. So keep this handy, or just know that there's a difference, and then you should Google this if you ever need to, something like that. I'm going to explain this to, I got to shrink this a little bit so you can actually see the whole thing without losing captions. There we go. Sorry, should have done this in advance. I'm going to give you an example here. We're talking about validity, and there's all these statistical terms that you'll see, and so I think it's helpful to see this, so we can talk about the statistics and what constitutes valid, not valid, too, because this gives a little more depth to our conversation here. If you've ever seen a crime drama on TV, and there's those courtroom scenes where there's a guy on the stand and a jury, and a bunch of attorneys are grilling him, in a perfect world, the court process would prosecute people who have committed crimes accurately. But if there's an innocent person on trial, you don't want to accuse them of a crime. So let's just break this down in a really simple example. Let's say a guy goes into a gas station, steals a candy bar, and he gets caught, and he goes to trial, and there's a whole bunch of his peers, and there's attorneys that are really mad about this candy bar or whatever, or whatever, you get the idea. In a perfect world, if that person stole the candy bar, and we're talking about this upper left quadrant where it says true positive, if it was true that he stole the candy bar, then he would positively be sent to prison for a lifetime for all of his Snicker theft or whatever. However, if that person, if somebody walked in and stole a candy bar, and then that guy was walking by as the thief ran out of the store, and the policeman comes around the corner right at that moment and said, you stole the candy bar. And he says, I'm innocent. I don't know. I just saw the guy run around the corner. And he actually didn't steal the candy bar. That means he's not really guilty of a crime. He actually is innocent. And if the court process works, all that discovery of evidence and all that kind of stuff, if the court process works, then the innocent person does not go to jail, right? Best case scenario. Here's another way of talking about the same exact thing. If a person has depression, you want a test that's accurately going to pick that up and say, yep, you have depression. However, if a person does not have depression, you want that test to also say, nope, you don't have it, right? That's kind of what we're going for here. The problem, though, is that sometimes if that person goes to trial and he stole that candy bar, we know he did, or the true, if we were to talk about the true score and have a God's eye view, we saw like he actually stole that candy bar, but through the court process, he goes free and he doesn't get held responsible for the candy bar he stole. That's a problem, right? We don't want that to happen. Same thing, if a person actually has depression and that test doesn't pick it up, that's a problem. The converse of that is that if a person was innocent and they didn't steal it and some other guy ran out first and the cop just showed up at the wrong time and this guy was in the wrong place, wrong time, and he goes to jail for a crime that he didn't commit, that's a bad scenario too, right? Same thing would be if a person does not have depression, but the test says, "Yo, yeah, you've got it bad here, buddy." That's not a good situation, right? What that means in statistical language, sometimes you guys will hear this, or you maybe have heard this before, is those are considered to be type 1 and type 2 errors. It's without going too deep into the details, those type 1 and type 2 errors are the probability of getting an incorrect result on a test. So I wanted to add that because not only does it add a little nuances of how these things can go wrong in these multiple ways, but it also adds a little bit of that statistical language that we can use if we've heard it before. This is the ballpark of what we're talking about here. Or if you hear it again, if you say the potential for the probability for a type 2 error is blah, 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 we're still in that range of talking about validity scores and validity information here too. So anyway, thank you for being with me. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully this was not too confusing. One of the things I hear from students is like their brains hurt after going through all this, and it's really hard to get down to how does this actually apply to clinical practice. And that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit more in discussions and assignments and that kind of thing. But this really is kind of hard stuff too, mostly because many of you are not going to be choosing tests on a regular basis or going through the test manual to determine whether it's a good one or not. It's just not a thing that happens a lot in the counseling process, but it can be so important to be able to do it when you're setting things up and when you're choosing a test. Because it's not uncommon for someone to come in and say, I have this condition, and you're like, oh man, it's been a while since I've seen somebody like that, or I don't have a good testing process for that because 95% of my other, or 99% of my other clients don't live with this condition, and now I have to figure out how to make a diagnosis, and you got to go out and find a test to help you understand this. In those situations, it's really important to have an understanding of how do you choose, how do you know? And so that's what we want to break down a little bit as much as we possibly can through discussions like this. But I know this stuff is really abstract, and so it's hard to translate this abstract stuff into clinical work. So that's something that we'll continue to work on through the class and to talk more about by getting some practice examples and stuff. So anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'll talk to you guys later. See ya.